the principal operations. So I'm responsible for the academic management of the college.
Right.
And deputy principal operations does all the real work.
Right, okay. And you've also, you teach New Testament.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're very happy to have you come along. And as an organisation, we very much appreciate the support that we've received from Table College. So thank you very much for that use of the facilities and also access to Grant Park Research Institute. So format will be Stephen will talk to us for a while, and then it's open discussion amongst this group, and then we'll break for supper at the end, and so the conversation can continue after that. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it over to you.
All right, thank you. Let me say that I've prepared this as I would one of my classroom lectures, and so it's quite interruptible. This is not a read manuscript thing, so it's quite interruptible, and I'm more than happy to engage as we go. The argument kind of builds, and so if there's part of the argument you don't like at the beginning, then maybe you need to engage with that so that the rest of it makes sense to you as we go. I have, I'm not sure how much time there is in this. It depends, I guess, on how much interaction and stuff there is. We may solve all the problems quickly, or we may just get to the bit where we look over the edge into the problems. But I want to start by exploring a kind of basic question that often Christians don't seem to have thought too much about. And that is Christianity a religion? When I was growing up in a church, we learned the kind of slogan that religion is man's search for God, Christianity is God's search for man. And so it suggested that religions were human creations, but Christianity wasn't. It came by kind of divine revelation, and the truthfulness of its content was based around its difference from other religions, or from religions. And what I want to suggest is that if we're going to talk about comparative religions, if we're going to talk about the impact of Greco-Roman religions on the New Testament, we actually have to think through the category kind of issue first. So is Christianity a religion? This is a picture of the 1893 Parliament of World Religions, which was held in Chicago. 1893 is kind of interesting because that's around the time that the history of religions school developed within New Testament studies. There was something in the air that brought together this kind of comparative religious kind of thing, an idea that perhaps Christianity wasn't without comparison, that Christianity wasn't unique, that it was one of a group that might be characterized as religion. And this idea that Christianity was similar or had links with other religions in terms of the framework of it, the experience of it, the practice of it, created a whole series of questions, and part of it was just a kind of modern development awareness of the rest of the world. Some of theology had gone on in a very narrow context in which Christians spoke to Christians and didn't have much experience of other religions. And the Greco-Roman religions were considered pagan and pre-Christian. Judaism was considered overcome by Christianity, and all that kind of stuff left Christianity on its own. But around the end of the 1800s, we got into this idea of comparative religion. So the question of is Christianity unique kind of depends upon the kind of perspective that you're asking the question from. If you're asking, does Christianity have unique content? Does it have a unique theology? Then the answer to that is fairly much yes. But every religion has its unique theology and content. The idea that you can put all religions into one kind of universal religion, that's been argued and tried, and it never works. The only person it pleases is the person who's sticking it together. It never pleases the people of the various religions that have been stuck together, because they always feel misunderstood. They always feel that the person hasn't really understood what their religion was about, because religions have different content. And in that sense, they're all unique or distinctive. But in terms of practices, all religions, he says, without being able to think of them all in his head at the same time, but all religions have common practices. And the practice of prayer. If we're not interested in content or the theology of it, but the practice of it, you can see commonality that religions expect some kind of communication between the participant and the god or gods that they worship. So prayer is common. Liturgical practice, the coming together in groups, having buildings of priests, or having sacred meals, having initiation rites. There's a commonality in practice. And what I want to suggest this evening is that commonality of practice doesn't mean commonality of content, or even derivative practice. It just means that because we're humans, we will do certain things in a common kind of way. And so often when people pray, they close their eyes. It doesn't mean that one religion stole it from another. It just means that when people want to concentrate, they close their eyes. When people come together, they eat meals together. Doesn't mean one religion saw another religion eating meals saying, hey, why don't we do that? It's just a common practice. And that becomes part of their religious practices. And personal experiences. If you actually talk with someone from another religion, you'll find that many of the things that you think is distinctive of your Christian experience is something that they experience as well. So if Christianity gives you a sense of peace or purpose, you'll find that other people have a sense of peace and purpose. So there's a commonality at that point, because after all, because we're common as humans, we're going to experience things in some kind of common kind of way. So when we talk about religion, is Christianity a religion? Is it unique? Is it like others? Thinking of what perspective you're asking the question from is fairly important. And when we look at the idea of the Gospels in their context, there's a difference between the content, there might be a commonality of practice, but there's a difference in the interpretation of the meaning of the practice and experience. There can be similar kind of experiences. The idea of being overcome in the Spirit is a Christian experience, but it's also a pagan experience. And so there's a kind of commonality of experience, even if we're talking about very different spirits with a very different meaning behind it and the implications of the experience. I would suggest that this is perfectly reasonable, because Christians take creation and incarnation very seriously. We actually believe that God created a world that was physical and put us into a world that is physical, in which we engage with one another. So we shouldn't be surprised that other people experience the world in a physical way and in a corporate community kind of way. We live in a material world, and experiences, even spiritual experiences, are mediated to us via our brain. If you stick nodes on a person's head and ask them to pray, whatever religion they're in, the same kind of region of the brain will light up. Because physically, That's the part of the brain that's involved in that kind of communication. That doesn't mean that they're praying to the same God, it doesn't mean they're praying the same prayer, it doesn't mean that they understand prayer to be the same thing. It just means that's the physical reality of how we experience the world around us. Creation is real, and so we should expect it to be real. And for some Christians, they are willing to accept the reality of a physical world, but somehow think that God exists in a spiritual realm, and so our experience of Him will not be in that physical reality, it will be in a spiritual realm too. But when we look at the incarnation, we see that incarnation is when God becomes flesh, Jesus, God dwelling among us. We see that it is the intention of God to actually enter into His creation, to engage with us. So God doesn't pull us out of the world, or God doesn't just speak from a spiritual realm and drop spiritual bombs onto us. He actually enters into our world and engages with us. And when He enters into our world, He enters into a particular reality. Jesus spoke Aramaic. He didn't speak English.
Are you sure? Didn't he? What?
But I think he spoke Aramaic with a Scottish accent. But he would have spoken Aramaic because he was a real person in a real place. Jesus wasn't some kind of timeless, universal spirit. He was a particular incarnate individual in a particular place at a particular time. And so it comes with culture and it comes with language. And so any kind of interaction between Jesus and the disciples, Jesus and the crowd, Jesus and whoever, is going to be engaged in this kind of cultural, framed, language-specific kind of reality. So we shouldn't be surprised that Jesus talks about prayer using the word for prayer that non-Christians use. And that word for prayer is used not just by Jews and Christians, but also used by Greeks and Romans and others who spoke a common language of Greek as part of that world culture, context kind of thing. So if we take creation and incarnation seriously, we do get into this question of the history of religions and how that kind of engages. So the history of religions is a particular school of theology within New Testament studies. It's associated with the 1880s and Gothenburg in Germany. Now this history of religion school was the Gutenberg, whatever. There's a reason. There's a reason I don't go to Germany to study New Testament, and not just because they have a history of religion school there, but because I don't do very good German. It started in the 1880s, and this is Otto Fliederer, who's considered the father of the history of religion school. He died in the 1900, and William Bousset, one of the significant proponents of that, he died in 1920. I got an email today telling me that Bousset's book called Kairos Christos, A History of Belief in Christ from the Beginning of Christianity to Irenaeus, which was first published in German back in 1913, and actually spoke about how Christianity had actually come out of a kind of Greco-Roman context, so it's kind of like we're talking about today, has been reprinted. And so the scholarship is still around. But it's interesting to know that it's been reprinted with a foreword by Larry Hurtado, a New Testament scholar from Edinburgh, who's basically saying that most of what Bousset said has not stood the test of time. And so the history of religion school within New Testament studies is something that you just, as a New Testament student, you study in the history of the discipline rather than practice, because it is something that belongs to that late 1800s, early 1900s, and didn't really sustain itself through the rest of the 20th century. So it was a dominant scholarly paradigm for about 40 years. But for fairly practical reasons, it failed to prove persuasive. And we'll kind of pick that up as we go through, I hope. So the history of religions school started with the premise that Christianity can be understood only if it is studied as one phenomenon among the many phenomena of religion in the Roman Empire. One of the key words here is phenomena, because what they're doing is not looking at the theology of it, but the outward appearances of it, the phenomena, the external, what can be seen. So it can only be understood in light of what can be seen of other religions, so in terms of its practice and its behaviors, rather than by its theology or its context and content. But what is distinctive of the history of religion's idea is that it can only be understood in this. And in most scholarly kind of discussions, you see pendulum swings. And so they've realized that New Testament studies have not been given due attention to the phenomena of religion, and therefore hadn't been paying much attention to its Greco-Roman context. And so they see the need for that, and instead of saying, let's take account of it, they actually swing the other way and say, it's the only way of looking at it. And because they swung all that way to the only way of looking at it, it really wasn't sustainable as a New Testament studies method. Within the history of religions, religion was considered as an historical phenomenon, understandable only in light of its origins and its roots. Biblical ideas are the product of the religious cultural milieu. Comparative religion, phenomena, and literature, not doctrinal concepts, must be utilized in interpretation. So they were interested in the practice of baptism as an initiation rite, and other religions had initiation rites. So they looked at the practice of it rather than looking at the theology of it, or the understanding of what was being done. The Eucharist, the sacred meal, the common meal when Christians gathered, was also seen in other religions as a meal at their time of gathering. And so that too was looked on as phenomena. And so they took a fairly, they were looking at the externals and were seeing that Christianity wasn't without comparison in that. But one of the other things to take into account is that the history of religions had an agenda. And part of that agenda went that Christianity is not unique, therefore it is not true. Part of this idea that if Christianity is not the only religion that practices an initiation rite, that means that baptism has been derived from somewhere else, and therefore the theology of it can't be true. It's only human development. And this agenda, which is, works only if you start with the assumption that something has to be without comparison in order to be true. that may have been the way that some of the Christians in the 1800s were presenting Christianity, and so they were reacting to that. But it's not logically required. Something doesn't have to be unique in order to be true. Something doesn't have to be without comparison in order to be of truth and value. They also would argue that, in terms of the agenda, is that the new in Christianity is not from revelation, but from religious cultural development and syncretism. So the Apostle Paul's understanding of baptism was synchronistically created by his looking at initiation rites within the mystery religions. And so they said that's where he got the newness of it, rather than understanding that Paul's new theology actually came out with a new paradigm and a new way of looking at the Old Testament and a new way of looking at Christian experiences. So just because the word revelation appears doesn't mean that it has to drop out of the sky. God speaks to us in real ways. And we hear God speak to us through others, through experiences, through reflection and thinking through the Spirit's leading and a whole range of other things that to someone might look like it's mediated through culture. But just because it comes to us in physical, concrete kind of ways, doesn't mean that can't be spiritual. It only means it can't be spiritual if you start with the assumption that Spirit is where God is, and He can actually be involved with creation. But the Christian doctrine of creation starts with the assumption that God creates creation and is able to enter into it as the incarnation points to. So the history of religions had a theory and they had an agenda, but for the theory and the agenda to work, they needed to find a way of transmission. How did Greco-Roman pagan ideas get into Christian thinking? How did they get into the New Testament? How did they get into Christian practice? And so they developed this theory of progressive development. In the beginning, you have Palestinian Jewish Christianity. This is the Christianity that would surround Jesus, the early Jerusalem church. And these people, because they are Jewish, would have had very Jewish ideas. And one of the strong Jewish ideas is monotheism. And therefore this group could not have understood Jesus as divine, because that would have been opposed to their Jewish monotheism. So in the early church, therefore, no discussion of Jesus as divine. But when you get outside of Palestine, when the gospel starts to spread up to Antioch, over into Ephesus, and it gets out into Hellenistic Judaism, then we get less pure Judaism. And therefore, they've already started, Judaism has already started to take on paganistic kind of ways of thinking. And therefore, there would be a kind of leakage point that would allow pagan ideas to come into the church through Hellenistic Jews. And then the gospel spread from the synagogues of the diaspora into the Gentiles of the Roman Empire. And so we would have non-Jews coming into the church, bringing with them all their kind of philosophy. And one of their religious philosophies is this idea of people being born with divinity. And so it comes into these pagan Christians and gets itself into the New Testament. And they say if you look at the layers, you'll be able to see that. There's a development that shows that this process is taking place. So they've got this theory of transmission. The problem with it is that it's a theory and it has no actual connection to reality. This is always a problem in New Testament studies, is that when you write your PhD and you do your study, it really makes a lot of good sense on paper, but when it gets off paper and actually gets investigated, it's not really as persuasive as it looks. And one of the significant developments was Martin Hengel, a German New Testament scholar, who wrote Judaism and Hellenism. And once Hengel had written this idea of a distinction between Palestinian and Hellenistic Judaism collapsed. The simplistic ideas that the Jews in Palestine were of a different type than the Jews in the diaspora, and the Jews in the diaspora were more liberal and less faithful, just didn't hold up to the analysis when you actually started to look at the text and where they came from, like where geographically they came from. So Hengel's put a real kind of dent into this. This was reasonably popular still in the middle 20th century. And Oscar Kuhlman's book on the titles of Jesus and the Christological titles actually layers the titles. What did the Son of Man mean in this layer? What did it mean in this layer? What did it mean in this layer? I read it. It doesn't help in terms of trying to separate it out like that. It doesn't help. But once Hengel had written his book on Judaism and Hellenism, this kind of collapsed as a framework.
How about the layer between Hellenistic and Greco-Roman? You said the bottom two collapsed,
yes.
But how about the top two?
Well, yes. What we find, that's my third point. I'll do my second point first before we get there.
Okay, sure.
Because what Larry Hurtado has demonstrated in One God, One Lord is that devotion of Christ can be found right at the first layer, at the Palestinian Jewish Christian layer. The worship of Jesus as a requirement of following Jesus, as a practice of following Jesus, is found right at this bottom layer. So what this idea that Jesus was to be worshipped, Jesus was divine, what was thought as coming in at this top layer is actually found right at the beginning. And you can't stratify it away. The language of devotion, which is there within Jewish worship, is found in Christian worship of Palestinian Jewish Christian worship. So this so Hurtado's kind of work, and that was that dealt a blow to Bousset's work that had been released in 1913. And then what has been established pretty well is that both Judaism and Christianity were pretty resistant to syncretism. They weren't very interested in adopting outside ideas into it. And so this idea that pagan Christians had pagan practices that could be welded onto the church is actually, we don't see that among the Gentile Christians, and we don't see that among the Hellenistic synagogues. And so in the same way, they were able to resist the general culture around them. Why? Because Judaism and Christianity both require single worship. If you're a pagan, a Roman pagan, You can move from, well, you don't move from, you can collect gods as you go. If you're in childbirth, you pick up the god that looks after childbirth. If you're in business, you pick up the god that looks after business. If you've got to send your stuff overseas, you pick up the god of the oceans that will protect them. They collect gods. Christianity insisted that you had to leave, you had to turn from your idol. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, which is dated to about 50, so just 20 years after the Easter event. Paul is saying you've got to turn from your idols and worship the living God. The synagogues of the diaspora, as well as the synagogues of Palestine, rejected this idea of other gods being added in. And so there was a real insistence on this kind of singular worship of God. Now, we do see in the New Testament some places where there is evidence that some in the church are being synchronistic. So we see evidences in Revelation and in Corinth of some Christians who are spending time at the temples as well as in the church. And these are attacked. So what we're not saying that all the pagan Christians, all the pagans who came into the church became Christians, suddenly left all their synchronistic practices behind them. But we're saying the church was working at establishing separation from that. They required conversion. Conversion, we think of conversion and religion going together. But that's because we live in a Christian post-Bible world. At the time of Greco-Roman religion, at the time of the 1st century, conversion wasn't thought of at all. People didn't convert to other religions. They just added them. Christianity required conversion, and that made it quite distinct. Alright, so in terms of the history of religions, what are the sources for comparison? There are more Greek and Latin authors out there than you can read. Some of them are, well, you may have read the Iliad, you may have seen the movie Troy, you've got some kind of awareness of some of the stuff, but there are stories. The Iliad is a story of the gods and humanity. There are philosophy texts, there are technical texts, there are lots of different kind of things that engage with the nature of Greco-Roman religion. And there are the Greek mysteries. The Greek mysteries, and we'll get to it in a bit more detail in a moment, is a form of religion within Greco-Roman religion that is more personal and more communal than common Greco-Roman religious practices. That makes it a little bit more like Christianity. And it has initiation practices, and it has sacred meals. And so often the difference with classic Greco-Roman religion is quite different, so there's not seem to be much comparison there. So they look to the Greek mysteries for these kind of comparisons, like Mithraism. Now, we're talking today about the pagan context, but in the New Testament studies, you actually find more conversation going on about the Dead Sea Scrolls and Second Temple Judaism texts. So Second Temple Judaism is all the Jewish writings from the 5th century BC through to the end of the 1st century, that kind of 600-year period. And we find a lot more points of comparison between the New Testament and other religious practices from the Jewish context than we do from the Greco-Roman context. And so this is where most of the study is taking place. in specific terms. And the Nag Hammadi library, which is Gnosticism, which is distinct from Judaism and distinct from Greco-Roman stuff. And so the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, they would be associated with the Nag Hammadi libraries. And so there was a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi texts were found post Second World War. Dead Sea Scrolls in the deserts of Israel, Nag Hammadi in the deserts of Egypt. And they then took 20, 30 years for them to be translated and interpreted and stuff. And so their impact on New Testament scholarship is through the 60s and 70s and into the 80s and current kind of stuff. Alright, so history of religions. It looks for the rituals and sees initiations and sacred meals as being there. It would be true, in terms of sacred meals, that the first century church's experience of church would be more like a pagan religion's experience than a 21st century church experience. Because they were closer in culture than we are. And we have moved in that 2,000 years to a different practice. We own buildings now, and we locate people in pews. We have memberships of churches in the hundreds instead of the 40 people that might have gathered in a home in Rome around the table. Whereas now, when we do communion, we did communion last week, you get a little glass and piece of stale bread, nothing like meals. And so we actually, there is more to be seen in comparison from their context than by thinking in our head, Eucharist, Holy Communion looks like what we do, rather than what what actually happened. And then experiences. Greco-Roman pagans looked to the gods for healings. Asclepius, the god for healing, had a healing sanctuary, kind of like a health spa, where people would go and pray for healing and seek healing, and some of them would experience healing. So the history of religions look to these kind of common phenomena in their analysis. But what we're looking at tonight is more the story-based side of things. I want to just talk briefly about the Gnostic Redeemer myth, because it's a kind of classic case in point. The Gnostics believe that spirit is good and matter is evil. So the high God is spirit. And there is a demigod, half God, under the spirit God, who created matter. And that was evil. And so the world is matter and evil. And within people, there is a spark of the spirit that is asleep and encased by the evil matter that is within. And it needs to be liberated. It needs to know that it should awake, so that it can be freed from the body. And when it is freed from the body, it will ascend back up to the spirit from which it originally came. But to get from this experience back to spirit, it has to go through a series of experiences. And it needs to know the right password to get past these. So it needs knowledge. Gnosis. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. So in the Gnostic Redeemer myth, a Redeemer is sent into the world to give knowledge to special people, a special group of people who are initiates, who will then be able to tell other people and expand out that knowledge so that they will be able to be redeemed and find salvation back in their spirit form after being encased in matter. So you have a descending and ascending Redeemer. Now, if you've done any work in John's Gospel, you know that John has a descending Redeemer and an ascending one. So Jesus is from above, not from below. He's going to ascend to the Father. And so this descending and ascending. And Bultmann, German Protestant scholar in the middle of the 20th century, made huge mileage out of this Gnostic Redeemer myth, and saying that Christianity had got its idea of salvation, this Redeemer that would come from the Gnostic Redeemer myth. And the Gnostic Redeemer story, myth here means the story, the collective story. Resurrection, the idea that you can find in pagan religions, the idea of gods that rise, dying and rising gods. Some gods die fairly regularly to be resurrected fairly regularly. I mean, it has to be one for one. You can't die 2 times in a row without the resurrection in the middle. So this idea of dying and rising gods as a kind of reality. And so it's said that obviously because Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that had to come from somewhere, and so they got the idea from these dying and rising gods. And virgin births, that's what we're looking at tonight. See all this context that we need before we get to the actual, we'll get there. Virgin births and the idea that out there. And I have, because I know that this is of particular interest, I've given you an article by October that pulls together all the divine births in Greco-Roman religion. So you'll get all the details there. So we've got the Gnostic Redeemer, dying and rising God, and we've got divine births all around. But one of the things that actually put the kind of death to this whole kind of comparative religious, the school of history of religion stuff, is the kind of stuff produced by Samuel Sandmeal, who is a Jewish scholar of the New Testament, and he was the president of the Society for Biblical Literature, and his address in 1961 called Parallelomania. And he described parallelomania as the extravagance among scholars which first overdoes the supposed similarity in passages and then proceeds to describe source and derivation as if implying a literary connection flowing in an inevitable or predetermined direction. Sandmeal is not saying that there can't be connection. He's just saying that a lot of what was going on is this parallelomania. You see, and he was speaking particularly of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls there was announced that there was something in there about a crucified Messiah. And that then became the basis of the Christian story of Jesus being crucified. Well, it turned out that it wasn't talking about a crucified Messiah. They were trying to piece the text back together, and the emphasis was wrong when they had the wider text and its context. It wasn't even talking about that. And to assume that if it was talking about that somehow that was what created the Christian story rather than the other way around or whatever, was just extravagance. And he was calling for a sensible engagement with the kind of material. It's not saying it can't be a connection, But let's not just overdo the similarities. Let's recognize the difference in there as well. And then not assume that the information is going in just one direction. Rituals are not self-interpreting, they require context. A sacred meal is not just a sacred meal, it's got a context. And it's the context that gives meaning to it. So you can't just take a meal practice in one religious experience and dump it into another and say it's the same thing. Context gives meaning. Agreement of external form does not equate to functional agreement. And stories also function in a world of meaning. And new ideas are, of course, expressed in common language. And so, well before a vocabulary is developed. So, when we talk about Jesus as the Son of God is a concept within Judaism. It's a concept within the Roman religions. It's a concept within Roman political thought. Lots of context for it. But it's not until the 3rd and 4th centuries that the church develops a language of the second person of the Trinity. But that's what they were talking about when they were talking about the Son of God. But they first began with the language that they had available to them, and then they tried to work through what they meant in its differences and stuff. And so just common language doesn't mean same thing. It just means that you need a language. You have to say something. You have to find a way to express it somehow, and that's part of the vocabulary. I'm giving you an article by Ferguson, or an extract from Ferguson's book, Early Christianity on the Mystery Religions. I'll leave you to work through it because it's more about baptism and initiation than it is about pagan birth stories. But there's a scarcity of information because they're mysteries, and so they didn't tell people what they were doing. So a lot of the information we get second or third hand, a lot of it comes from Christian writers 100 years later. Here it's talking about the mysteries in order to compare themselves with it and contrast themselves and make themselves look good. So the information we've got is partial and late. It's missing from the Palestinian layer. There are no mystery religions in Palestine. They're out in the Roman Empire world. And so they don't actually explain how things began. They are much later kind of thing. The dying and rising gods are not resurrected. Now, I should stop here and go into an explanation of what the resurrection is. It is not resuscitation. It is not coming back to life in the same world that you died. Resurrection is about entering into the new age, the new creation. The present evil world and the new creation. And the marker of that is the resurrection. So you need a linear view of time, and you need a view of time that has an end and a beginning for resurrection to mean what it means in the Christian gospel. If you've got a cyclical view of time, of reality and experience, if you've got a view of time that goes with the seasons, and so winter is death, spring is birth, and you've got that kind of cyclical view, then that is not the same. So just because they're no longer dead doesn't mean they're resurrected in the way that Christians use the word. They're just different concepts. And so to compare them is to misunderstand what the comparison is. And baptism and Eucharist is quite distinctive, with no stray pagan elements. If it was being borrowed from the mysteries, you would expect some of that to come across and to be there just kind of unexplained hanging around. That would be evidence. So evidence that the pagan, the mystery religions had trampled in would be like footprints left, unexplained. But we don't see that. What we see is a distinctive interpretation and practice. So the Eucharist meal is quite different from the temple kind of experiences. And while they might be common language, initiation and meal, and while there might be common language doesn't actually mean that they've derived the thought from it. Anyway, you can read the Ferguson thing. But let's look at divine births. And so I've given you a page that is just filled with extracts from various sources that are easily obtained. And the first one is Dionysus, who is the god of wine. Dionysus' mother was a mortal woman, the daughter of King Cadmus, and his father was Zeus, the king of the gods. Zeus' wife, Hera, discovered the affair when Semele was pregnant. Zeus had a bad habit of playing around, and Hera was a fairly jealous wife. Her problem was that her husband was immortal, and so she couldn't really fix it. So Zeus did pretty much what he wanted. But Hera wasn't willing to give up on that. And so in the case of Hercules as well, she goes after him. But in this case, he goes after Dionysus. And appearing as a nurse, Hera befriended Semele, who confided in her that Zeus was the actual father of the baby in her womb. Hera pretended not to believe her and planted seeds of doubt in her mind. Curious, Semele demanded of Zeus that he reveal himself in all his glory as proof of his godhead, of his godness. Though Zeus begged her not to ask this, she persisted, and he agreed. Therefore, he came to her as a god, not in the kind of more human form that he had used when he had impregnated her. So he came to her wreathed in bolts of lightning. Mortals, however, could not look upon an undisguised god without dying, and she perished in the ensuing blaze. She's 6 months pregnant. And that would have been the end of Dionysus, except that Zeus rescued Dionysus by sewing him into his thigh. A few months later, Dionysus was born in an island where Zeus went to release the now fully grown baby from his hip. So this is the birth of the conception and birth of Dionysus. Dionysus' problems with Hera was not yet over. At Hera's orders, the Titans seized the newly born son of Zeus, who is a horned child crowned with serpents, and despite his transformations, tore him to shreds. These they boiled in a cauldron, while a pomegranate tree sprouted from the soil where his blood had fallen, but rescued and reconstituted by his grandmother Rhea, who is the mother of Zeus, the high god. He came to life again. After this, Zeus arranged for his protection and turned him over to the nymphs to be raised. When he grew up, he discovered wine and the whole kind of thing that goes on with it, and then taught mankind about wine. And so he's the only god that is outside you, and when you drink is inside you as well.
Sounds pretty similar.
And this is why, by and large, New Testament scholars don't look to this for parallels. What we have here is a very different context for something that isn't, that if you extract the headings, the high god of heaven has a son by a human. This son dies and comes to life again. And this son brings blessings to the world and fills their followers. That sounds Christian. That sounds gospel. But when you actually look at the story and it is put within its context of a world of gods that is very different from the Jewish context that the New Testament gospel stories are framed within, is quite different. Romulus is not born of God, but he is born of a between a god. Might be Zeus again. Oh no, it's Mars. I think it might be Mars. Anyway, Mars and Vestal Virgin, I think, who is out in the field, in the field of Mars, which is outside the walls of now Rome. And she meets this god who impregnates her, and she has twins, and Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, are born that way. And now there's other ways that story is told that has somebody dressing up in the form of a god to deceive the girl into thinking that she's been impregnated by a god. So there are different stories around that. But the idea of Romulus as the son of a god is there in the Greco-Roman text. But sex with gods is not virginal conception. It is not like the gospel stories of a virgin conceiving, where the power of God comes upon them. There's no sex, there's no male present, there's no symbolic male present. I mean, in Greco-Roman stories sometimes it's a snake, which is the symbolic presence of the god impregnating the female. It is towards the second half of the 1st century, there is some beginning of reinterpretation of the Greco-Roman stories that moves away from sex, that is unseemly for a god to have sex with a human. And so then they start to talk about power stuff. But the evidence, and some of that is in Ferguson as well. Raymond Brown. It is not a similar thing. Yes, it's true. Oops, I just went forward. Yes, it's true that we've got a being with a divine human parentage. But that's not the framework of the story. A different framework gives different interpretation to what that means. And that's now in the article by Talbot, what he does though is say that what these stories are doing is signaling that an individual is superior. You come across an individual who is the powerful one for your nation, that defeats the enemies in battles. And one of the things you say is, this person is so distinct that they must have a god for a parent. And so the stories of Romulus' birth is because he is so distinct that surely, I mean, who plays in Troy? You've got Brad Pitt. Such a good-looking guy has to have a divine parent in the mix. He's just too good-looking. And Eric Bana was the other one. So in the Iliad, these people have, in the story, divine parents because they are so distinct. And also as a way of honouring benefactors. In Greco-Roman culture, the ones that provide blessings are the gods. And so if there's a human who provides blessing, like the emperor, then it's not unnatural in that context to start to see the emperor as the son of a god, or a god in terms of Julius Caesar and stuff. So what Talbot says is, all right, if you're looking for transference, you're not going to get it. You can't get from those stories to the Gospels. But he asks, if you're listening to the Gospel stories in a 1st century world, and you hear the story of Jesus' virgin conception, what do you think? You will think that he is a superior individual, and that he is the benefactor for us. So it communicates. So there's this, just because the stories are so different, doesn't mean that we can't learn something from them in terms of the context of how the New Testament is heard and read. But to actually point to it as the source of the virgin conception is just is to expect transference too much. I mean, it's parallel with mania.
I'm sorry, on Dionysus,
Yes.
there's also a claim that Dionysus turned water into wine.
Yeah, I didn't find that, but I wasn't looking really hard. But he is the god of wine. And so he taught the world how to grow vines, how to distill it or ferment it and stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised. But again, to go from that story to John 2, in which the wine, in the context of the wedding feast, is the messianic banquet celebration. So in Jewish context, when the Messiah comes, the blessings will pour out, and that blessings will be the wine. It has a more immediate Jewish context, and in terms of the basic simplicity, when it is explainable within its own context, to go to an alien context doesn't make a whole lot of interpretive sense. If you then went and thus Jesus taught his disciples how to ferment wine in a special way or something, then you would have those footprints. You've got the story, then you've got some kind of evidence that it's being read in that Greco-Roman context. But you don't have any of those footprints. All you have is a very Jewish context story. This is point in John's Gospel, this is a sign that the Messiah has come. So it has a very Jewish context. Yes, so in terms of nativity stories, they're clearly Jewish, not pagan. Luke 1 and 2, Luke is a Gentile author, and he writes in these first two chapters a very Jewish story. The songs of Mary and Zechariah stuff are very Jewish, very Septuagint, and the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So the context is very Jewish. There are no pagan footprints in the story. And in the Gospels, the kind of footprint you might get is a statement saying something that God did not impregnate Mary as a man does a woman, because that's not done. So what you would have evidence that the author had in front of them that kind of story and is writing against it or using it in some way. But there's no footprints of that kind. What you have is a very Jewish context story. And so if you're looking for the background of the nativity stories, you go to the Jewish writings rather than the Greco-Roman writings. And the stories are told with intent. They're not just, and this is sometimes that we forget, we look at it just for the history and the argument, is it historical? If it is historical, then it must be true, and the Bible is true, therefore Jesus is true. That's not the way they were arguing when they wrote the Gospels. Jesus is true because of the resurrection. And there wasn't yet a Bible to be proved by it. But Jesus is true because of the resurrection, not because of the virgin birth. What we have here, though, is a story with intent. It's not just a historical account. It's telling us that Jesus was the Son of God from birth. Jesus didn't earn Son of Godness. He was Son of God from the beginning. We also have Son of God associated with the baptism, God's special selection of him, Jesus is proved Son of God in the temptation narratives when he overcomes Satan. He's Son of God because of his obedience on the cross. Son of God is a continually communicated thing in the Gospels. And so those narratives fall within that purpose. They're not trying to prove that Jesus is better than all the other people, that he's the strongest miracle worker around. When we get to Jesus' miracles, they never tie it back to his birth. They never say Jesus did this miracle because he was born of God. They say Jesus did miracles with the authority of God. It is to do with Jesus' role there, not with his birth. There's actually no link in it, so they're not using the story. So the kind of things that you would expect that would generate it. Pagan people do miracles because they've got divine birth. So Christians say Jesus did miracles, therefore he needs a divine birth. But they would link that. You would see the footprints that that's what they were engaging with, but there's none of those kind of footprints. In fact, Mark doesn't even give us a birth story. John doesn't give us a birth story. So in terms of Christian gospel, the virgin conception is not a key doctrine.
Is that why there's no record that Peter and John ever asked Mary?
Pardon?
Well, Peter and John, there's no record ever asking Mary whether it's actually true.
Right. Yes. Well, there's no actual argument about it. Now, one of the things in the early church is that if somebody is introducing a new doctrine, what you get is pushback. So you get a sense of, in 1 John, those who say that the Son has not come in the flesh are wrong. Yeah. So you've got pushback. So you can see that somebody is in that community is saying that Jesus is a spirit and not a human being, not a flesh. Pushback. Because you've got a new doctrine coming in. There's no kind of pushback in the nativity stories. They're just there. They're not, even in the Gospels. Maybe they're hinted at later on. You know, Jesus, is called Son of Mary rather than Son of Joseph. So there's hints of it. But there's no pushback, there's no argument, there's no attempt to prove it, because it's just part of their account. If it was created in order to argue something, you'd look for more argument and more engagement. If it came late to the party, like Matthew introduced, Mark didn't know it, Matthew introduced it, then you would get some kind of pushback that critiques it or offers an alternate interpretation for Jesus' birth. There's none of that. And for me, the key thing is, and this goes against a lot of Christians' pet hobby horse, is that Isaiah did not predict that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. In the Hebrew of the text of Isaiah, it's a young woman. And in the context of the passage in Isaiah, it's saying that in this amount of time that it takes for a young woman to get pregnant, to have a child, and for the child to grow to this particular age, God is going to act. It's a time frame. It's not a prediction that the Messiah will be born of a virgin. It's not possible in the Hebrew to read it that way. It is possible in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that takes across the word for young woman and uses a word that can be young woman or virgin. But Matthew is a Jewish Christian writing for a Jewish Christian audience, and so it's unlikely that he's using the Septuagint to get to his so it's unlikely that he's got this idea that there's going to be a Messiah born of a virgin. What Matthew does He's used a fulfillment criteria. What Matthew does is he looks at the life of Jesus and then finds parallels back in the Old Testament. So Jesus fled Bethlehem and went into Egypt. And then he came from Egypt back when Herod had died. In the Old Testament, isn't it true that out of Egypt God told his son? Now the son there is Israel. But Matthew sees the connection. And so he points it out. Matthew works from Jesus' experience back to interpreting the Old Testament. You wouldn't get there reading in a straight line. There's not a list in Jewish Second Temple Judaism of things that the Messiah will. How will we know the Messiah? Well, because Isaiah says he'd be born of a virgin. Because there wasn't a checklist that Matthew had to create the story to fit. What he had was a story and a lot of experience of reading the Old Testament, and he saw the connections. So it seems to me that the most simplest explanation for why Matthew has it in the story is because that's what Matthew understood to be true, and he puts that back and he sees the connection to it.
So he's not working in proof text mode?
No, he's working in fulfillment mode rather. It's not prophetic proof text and it goes forward, but fulfillment that reads back. I mean, the different
So seeing a connection after the event.
Yes, and he sees it because he's got it in front of him and he's so familiar with the Old Testament. Yeah. And so he sees those connections.
Was Matthew then actually saying that Mary had to be a virgin? Or...
No, what I'm suggesting is that Matthew understood Mary to be a virgin, yeah. And then he saw the Isaiah connection, and he puts that in fulfillment.
In the Septuagint?
Yes.
Okay.
With the Isaiah passage, he makes that connection, yeah. Because he believes that. Now that doesn't make it true. It just means that Matthew had the story in front of him and made the connection rather than creating the story out of the connection. So in terms of Matthew's experience, he's got that Jesus was born of a virgin. He sees the connection. Luke has Jesus is born of a virgin, and he sees the connection with John's birth. John's birth was special, but Jesus' birth was most special. And so he puts it in those kind of terms. So there's reasons to believe it. Now, we don't have time to do all this, but for me, when it comes to biblical stories, we're looking at a web of relationships. If you say, I believe in the virgin birth, because the Bible told me so, that could be fine for you, but it's not much of an argument for somebody who doesn't accept the Bible. So I want to suggest there are other ways of doing it, and the reality is that we do draw upon a number of sources. Yes, it's because the Bible tells me so, but there are also good New Testament scholars that will make the case for why Luke's story and Matthew's stories come from different sources and have and don't solve the evidence of midrashes, of being created out of the story and stuff like that. So you can make the argument. Also because I'm actually a Christian with experience of God at work in the world, I'm quite happy with miracles happening, so it doesn't stress me that it is a miraculous birth. I don't think it's what the gospel depends upon, but it wouldn't surprise me if indeed miracles happen with the birth of Jesus. There are reasons in terms of understanding the story. And I've met Jesus. And if Jesus is the living Lord of the universe, that he has a virginal conception, incarnation, doesn't surprise me. So it's not any single reason I believe in the virgin birth. It's for a connection of reasons. And what I've got here is that the resurrection and the incarnation for me are central doctrines. If it turns out that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, I'm not going back to the virgin birth to hold my faith together. Resurrection is crucial. Resurrection points to incarnation, and the whole of the story follows from that. So those are central doctrines. I spend a lot more time looking at the resurrection than I do the virgin birth. They're not main doctrines. But I think the virgin birth is significant. Not just as a historical point, not just as to try and persuade someone that Christianity must be true because Jesus was born of a virgin. But I think it's important because it tells us that life is filled with divine mystery, that there's something unique about Jesus. He's God's gift to the world. He bridges the chasm that divided God from creation. And then he gives us hope for participating in the life of God, because God can enter into our life, we can enter into his, and he's the witness of the breadth and the wonder of God's grace. So the virgin birth is significantly true. It's not just true, a doctrine to believe, or a historical event to prove. It is significantly true. It has significance. It makes a difference because it tells me that God takes the initiative, that God takes risks, and that God enters into a world. It's part of the gospel story. It's not just an event of itself. And I worry sometimes that Christians can get caught up in arguing about something and actually lose the purpose of the story to start with, the significance of it. So it's not just true, but it's significantly true. So comparative religious studies started off with looking for genealogy, how one religion grew out of another. What was its father, what was its grandfather, and who was its great-grandmother, kind of stuff. It looked for genealogy, and that form of comparative religious studies has fallen away because they don't have that kind of, you can't see that kind of progression and connection. So there's more emphasis on analogy by looking at how one religion acts and talks and thinks and practices with another one, and looking at those analogies to give you an interpretive framework for engaging with both of them. Not trying to prove which one came from which, but saying, well, what do those stories tell us, like Calvin? Greco-Roman stories point to the significance of the uniqueness of the person, or the significance of the person, and the role as benefactor. Well, once we see that, we can look at the Gospels and see if there's some kind of connection there. Is that also what we see in that? So there's an analogy is useful. But where comparative religious studies have got to in our time is that it's each on its own terms. Nobody wants to study Hinduism from a Christian point of view, because Hinduism and Christianity are different. And so if you ask, what does Hinduism think about sin? You've already forced Hinduism to fit a Christian mold, where sin is important. So even before you get to what does Hinduism say about sin, you should first go to Hinduism and see what is important to it. Or if you decide that karma, because karma could be interpreted in sin, judgment and stuff, but that would be to impose a Christian category on another religion, or to take another religion and impose it on Christianity. And in terms of comparative religion, not just Christian comparative religion studies, but in terms of comparative religion studies as a discipline, they've moved right away from this comparative stuff to trying to see things on its own terms and to be true to the religion that you're looking at. In terms of New Testament studies, sociocultural criticism, which is the background that I have in my studies, looks to the importance of context for hearing meaning. And so when we go to the Gospels, when we go to the birth narratives, we're looking at it in light of Second Temple Judaism. What are the points of continuity and discontinuity? What does Luke, who is a Gentile pagan, a non-Jewish author, tell us right at the beginning of his Gospel? That Jesus is the fulfillment of the promises of the Old Testament. Continuity. There are people who suggest that when we get to Acts, that Luke thinks that the gospel is non-Jewish. It's turned its back on Judaism. But right at the very beginning of Luke Acts is the stories that tell us of continuity. So we look to Second Temple Judaism for the context of the gospel. And we look to Greco-Roman world for the context in terms of culture, religion, philosophy, politics. Big discussions now in terms of Jesus is Lord. Caesar is Lord. What does it mean to say Jesus is Lord in a world that says Caesar is Lord? Does that mean that they're clash of empires? And so there's empire studies or empire criticism is a big kind of discussion in polling studies, because they're looking at the context to try and hear what would have been heard. And this is a line that comes from Talbot, well, a modified form of a line that comes from Talbot. What would the original hearers have heard when they heard the virgin conception stories? We ask that because we want to be faithful to the text. We want to participate in the conversation between Luke and his readers, between Matthew and his readers. If we go to the text and say, we want to know, is it historical? We've imposed our agenda onto the text. The first place to start, and there's nothing wrong with asking that question. That's a fine question to ask. You can spend a lot of time studying it. But it's not the first question. The first question is, what did Luke want us to hear when he told us that story? What did Matthew want us to hear when he told us that story? That way we can be faithful interpreters of the text. We can listen to the text in the way that it speaks, rather than just using it to meet our ends. We actually engage with it and hear what the gospel story was trying to say. Now that's gone for an hour and a half.
Just a question.
Yes.
Are the cleaners coming in at 9 o'clock?
I have no idea. I have no idea. This is the break, and so I don't know what's going on. I saw a cleaner out there.
Stephen, can I ask, are
Yes.
there groups in Adelaide who claim to be Christian but are actually practicing Gnostic beliefs and philosophies?
I don't know of them, but Hegel, is it, there's a female scholar, Hegel, that talks about that interprets the gospel from a Gnostic perspective. And I do know that her books are read by groups and that look for a Gnostic experience of the gospel. But I didn't tell you, the problem with the Gnostic Redeemer myth is it's a myth. There's no text that gives you all that stuff in one place. And what happened was the scholars took bits or pieces and used their understanding of the Christian story to put it back in place so that they could have something that made sense, because it made sense to them. Once they had put it back together that way, they forgot that they had put it together and actually thought that that's the way the story was told. But no Gnostics tell the story of the descent.
So they put it back.
Yes, because they had bits of the story in different texts that came from different places. They pasted it together. And then the second thing that killed it was that people are pretty sure that Gnosticism is a 2nd century philosophy. So it's post-Christian rather than pre-Christian. And so the idea, so it's more likely to have come from Christianity than it formed Christianity. So the whole Gnostic Redeemer myth turned out to be one of those parallel mania stuff, where they had some connections and then just lost, it got carried away extravagantly with it.
Yeah, I had a look at the Gnostics, so-called Gnostics, and they're not Gnostics.
In Adelaide?
Yeah, Adelaide
and
other places. What they actually teach, and it's a 20th century version,
Yes.
and it's based a lot on the works of Hermes Trismegistus and the Golden Tablet and a few of the other, the ancient grimoires, which were total rubbish anyway. And somebody has obviously pulled out bits and pieces and thrown them together. But I actually went to one of their introductory lectures, and it was so much gobbledygook, it was quite obvious they had no idea what Gnosticism was.
Yeah, Gnosticism can be appealing because it's about secret knowledge, and I've got secret knowledge and you don't. And it's about knowledge rather than kind of life. Among Gnostics you get some who are very aesthetic and some who are wild, because the body doesn't matter, it's about the spirit. And so you can kind of do what you like with it, and in the 21st century people like religion that you can pretty much do what you like with.
William James's gifted lectures of about 100 years ago, the variety of religious experience, is that coming out of these sort of studies?
Yeah, so when we went back to he's looking at this kind of personal experience thing, and Otto, the idea of the holy. He too was part of. I don't know if I think James was non-religious.
He was a psychologist.
Yes, yes. So he wasn't actually part of the history of religions movement, but Otto was. And so in that time, this idea that there is a common religious experience that is common across all religions was part of the environment, part of the idea of all religions coming together, all religions all lead to the same point. And it kind of appeals to us because experience is self-authenticating. If I've had an experience, it must be true. Even if I've misinterpreted it, it's my experience, therefore it's true to me. And so this move to using experience as the shaper of the conversation was part of that early 20th century and development. So it fit right in.
The comparative religions and that sort of study seems to have actually started with Lord Herbert back in 1624 with his founding document for deism, Liberata, because he didn't believe in any revelation, and therefore you could do an independent study of comparative religion studies.
Yes, although in terms of New Testament studies, it's the late 1800s, and this is and what I've talked about is within that New Testament studies framework. In the UK, so this is a German thing. In the UK, history of religions look towards the evolution of religion, starting from atheism through totemism, Vedism, through until you get to ethical monotheism. So this idea that there was a developmental line, the problem with that is you can't find a straight line anywhere, and you can't, even within the Old Testament, because those bits of those are there in the Old Testament, but you can't get any kind of straight line that leads to ethical monotheism in the end. So there are different approaches to this history of religions kind of thing, but in terms of does a pagan story lead into the New Testament, that was a concern for New Testament studies and was part of the thing.
Stephen, the Masons with their secret knowledge and codes, is that dabbling in Gnosticism?
No, see, that would be a comparative religious kind of question. You can study it on its own. That they have initiation rites is common in the mystery religions, but whether or not they derive their process from the mystery religions, you would be looking for footprint evidence of that. And some of the language they use gets back into Persian religions, which is Mithraism is a mystery religion with Persian background, so maybe they took some from there, but it may just be that they like the idea of secretness, and men are by and large competitive, and so moving up through the ranks is appealing. So similar phenomena, but you would have, I don't personally have knowledge that suggests that one derived from the other.
Yeah. I've read about a guy called Cathars, I think they had a belief, I think, they were Christians, I think, but they believed in the matter being evil and up there being good. I've only read about it a long time ago and I've forgotten a lot of the details, but it reminded me they only disappeared only a few hundred years ago, I think.
Yes.
So is that the source of some of the stuff or not?
Gnosticism as a 2nd century phenomena did compete with the Catholic Church, the main church, for a while. But one of the things that Gnosticism postulates, this matter being evil, therefore the creator God cannot be the God of the world, therefore the Old Testament God cannot be the real God, because the Old Testament God creates the world, and therefore the created God is not the God that Jesus refers to. And so you get a separation of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And one of the things that the church was really clear about was that it was flowing from the Old Testament. The connection that Luke makes between the Old and the New stood across the whole church. And so Gnosticism was resisted because it denied God. It offered a different God, but it was a different God because it wasn't the created God. And so it wasn't, in the end, very successful. So there were groups of them, but not successful.
Rob was referring to the Cathars.
Cathars, yeah.
Yeah, we're in the 12th and 13th century.
They disappeared in the 30s, or somewhere in there, I think.
And
they had very much what you described, and they were quite strong in their time.
Yes, well, they're more likely to have been a revival, I think, because in terms of...
so they didn't trace back to the 7th century or something like that?
Yeah, well, see, 7th century is a long way from the first.
So 2nd, I should say.
Oh, 2nd century. Well, I would be suspicious because the documents that we have from the 2nd century are not that specific, and so it would be a reconstruction based on speculation rather than see. I mean, the Gospel of Judas, for instance, it's not even clear who that document belongs to in terms of group, and so to move from the Gnostic texts to Gnostic communities and to locate them in particular places with particular beliefs is a very speculative kind of process. So they might claim that kind of link and look to it for inspiration, but it's more likely to be inspirational than actual.
I think you more or less summarised a lot of these explanatory stories and raised lots of questions about them. But I'm just thinking of, say, a more broader project that we've engaged in our culture, what you could call as naturalistic explanations of things.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's the basis of science. We can explain physical phenomena by sort of moving the supernatural to one side. So it seems to me that there's at least a legitimate project in trying to explain the historical development of Christianity in naturalistic terms.
Yes, that's...
Do you think that's, I mean, can we do that? Or if we can't, is that evidence for divine action?
I think that's part of what the History of Religions school was trying to do. Coming out of 19th century Germany, that was definitely a trend in the New Testament studies, is to look for naturalistic explanations, and they were going to find it and stuff. For me, the issue is about the resurrection. There is no naturalistic explanation for resurrection. It's either true or it's not true. The idea that they thought Jesus was alive and all that kind of stuff is just hopeless. You can deny it if you want, but you can't explain it. And if the resurrection is true, which I happen to believe, but if the resurrection is true, then you have a new world, and with that comes this the gift of the Spirit. So Pentecost is connected to that, and that's where the church normally looks to in terms of its supernatural kind of engagement. That the miracles are kind of affirmed by the resurrection, rather than the miracles proving the resurrection. The resurrection is kind of like the linchpin. Once you get that, then the stuff either side works. But if you don't have that, then yeah, you've got miracles, but you've got other miracle workers of the time. What would make Jesus different? Well, yeah, he had claims that went with his miracle workers that were different, but what would make that true? Well, if he was crucified, then God had abandoned him, so God hasn't affirmed him at all. And so his claims are hopeless, and his miracles are kind of unexplained. But if there's a resurrection and God has affirmed him, what he said, it makes sense, and then his miracles are evidence that the kingdom has come. So it all flows back from the resurrection rather than forward. I mean, we read the story forward, but you get the heart of the story at Easter, and the rest falls from there.
With these comparative religions, there's Friedrich Heiland, who found 7 commonalities.
Yes.
Which is actually quite interesting.
Experience-based
commonalities, but
experience-based or practice?
Both.
The trouble usually is that I mean, Buddhism is clearly a religion, but it's got no gods.
No, that's the point. But the interesting point is that from the perspective of human experience, that religion does contain similarities.
Yes, because we'd expect God. I mean, the same way, while language is different, we hear the same way.
For instance, the word love appears in all religions. It's important.
Yeah, I guess I would say that love is a word that has to be interpreted by context.
Sure.
And when we say God is love, we've got the cross context.
The concept of something good.
Yes. Yes. And I mean, in terms of the Old Testament, you've got 10 Commandments being similar to stuff in other religions. You've got creation stories that are similar and stuff like that. So there's commonness at different levels, but when you look at what the story is, you've got a different story, and that's why all religions in the end have to be dealt with as discrete. And so Christians aren't claiming something special to themselves when they say that they want their religion interpreted in its own terms and not through some other religion's lens.
I disagree with most of what you said.
Yeah, that's all right.
One question, you said Christianity is unique. In what context?
In terms of content?
Well, no, one aspect of Christianity is unique, because for my studies, I have not been able to find anything in Christianity that is unique. Everything, every idea, every concept within Christianity has been borrowed from somewhere else. So Christianity came along, it was nothing new.
Christianity came out of Judaism, so it wasn't meant to be something new. But something happened that turned Judaism into Christianity, and that something was the resurrection. That changed the way the Old Testament was read and interpreted and practiced. So the continuity, discontinuity stuff revolves around the resurrection. Now, what I was trying to say is that the resurrection is a unique Christian concept. You don't get that.
But it's not.
It is.
Because the concept of the resurrection was based on the myth of Osiris.
No. No,
It was.
because Osiris in the Egyptian context doesn't have the new creation, old creation, new creation framework. And so when they talk about Osiris, who's the ruler of the dead or whatever, when they talk about Osiris and giving life into the world of the dead, it's not talking about the change that comes from the old creation into the new creation. It's a different concept. I'm not saying that the Egyptians didn't have some sense of the afterlife. They didn't have some sense of the gods providing pathways into the afterlife, and some didn't use the language of death and life. But that is not the language that's in the New Testament. That's not the framework in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And there is no link that takes us from the Egyptian stories into the New Testament stories.
Forget about the Old Testament and the role of Osiris later on. The original resurrection myth was that Set, Osiris' brother, killed Osiris and he chopped him into 13 pieces and he threw them all over Egypt. His sister wife, Isis, travelled all around Egypt, finding the various parts and brought them back together. She found 12 parts. The 13th part, the penis, was missing. So Isis was a witch. She was steeped in magical abilities. So she created a penis out of gold. And she then used spells to resurrect Osiris. But then he impregnated her, and she then bore Horus. That was the old...
I've read the New Testament stories, and I can say that what you're describing there is not what the New Testament is saying when it talks about resurrection. It's using the Hebrew concept of resurrection. Is that at the end of time, God would raise his people to judgment. The people would be affirmed and honoured by their faithfulness to him. And so it was an end time event. And so what we have in the New Testament is that the Jewish end time event is brought into the present time in the death and resurrection of Jesus. So it is a wholly different story with a wholly different meaning. And just because you might want to use the same English word, resurrection in the Egyptian context and resurrection in the New Testament context, those are actually not the word. The Egyptians didn't speak in English, and the New Testament writers didn't write in English. They wrote, well, in Egyptian and in Greek, and the words mean different things, even if we turn them into resurrection. Resurrection is a word with theological content and depth and colour and meaning and flavour to it, and it is not comparable to a
reality too.
So it's just not. So it's different. Now, if you want to say that a word that appears in one religion as rising and a word that appears in another religion as rising make the two linked, that's the kind of comparative religious studies I think that's fallen into disrepute, because it doesn't deal with each of them on their own terms. And I think we wouldn't want to be trying to turn the Egyptian story into a Christian story by reinterpreting it through Christian framework. But in the same way you don't interpret the Christian story through the Egyptian story, you take them on their own terms and you'll see that they're addressing different things. Alright, so I think that I have more than stretched your patience and goodwill. So I hope it's been kind of interesting and is kind of useful. This kind of stuff, when we're doing the history of New Testament studies, is a discipline in itself. Greco-Roman religions is a discipline in itself. this is a multi-discipline thing, and the fact that you got through it, or almost got through it, I don't know when you actually dropped out, but the fact that you almost got through it, you should be commended for being able to span such a kind of breadth of ideas and concepts all in one evening. So hopefully it's been of some use to you.
Thank you. I found that absolutely fascinating, and I really enjoyed it. You went way over time, but I'm not criticising you for that. I think it was worthwhile. And I have a special present here for the god Dionysus. I hope you like.
I have children who like mine.
Yeah, well, it should be a good gift.
Yeah, so I'll pass that on and make it sound like it came from me. So. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I encourage you to continue the conversation on afterwards. Just encourage you to stay for supper and talk to Stephen.
Could I seriously point you to that Talbot article in terms of Greco-Roman stories, pagan stories of the other one. Oh no, that's right. Sorry, yeah, that one. The misunderstood Jesus. Sorry, the historical. Yeah, the historical Jesus in context. That article. When I read that, I thought he had done all the work for me. So there you go.
Right.
Okay.